Hi, I want to make my next video. I was actually already thinking about this one before I finished uploading the last one. And this is something where I think it's an area where atheists and theists spend a lot of time and they talk past each other. And therefore, both of them walk away from the discussion thinking that their time was wasted because they're speaking to someone about things and they think they're using the same language, but they're really not. I think an important area to consider is that there's more than one definition of the word faith. So it's actually kind of used as a gotcha from theists to atheists when they say something along the lines of, well, you have faith in the chair that you're sitting on, or you have faith in airplanes in particular that they'll get you from one place to another. I have faith in God, but you're exhibiting faith. Why do you believe that? Well, the short answer is that we have evidence and things that can convince you that it's statistically safe to get on an airplane. When you go to the airport, you see other airplanes taking off, landing safely, passengers getting off, and they've survived the journey. That is not the same thing as saying, well, because you have faith in that, why couldn't you have faith that there's also an eternal being? So the definition of faith from Webster's dictionary, there's numerous ones, but I think one that's kind of the most succinct is a firm conviction or a belief in something. There are some definitions of the word faith that involve, a belief in a religion or a deity, but I would say that that's kind of the common one that is used by people. Faith is a conviction in something or a belief in something. What the term does not do in the dictionary definition is it doesn't say why you have that belief or that conviction. So it doesn't say what you're using as your basis of conviction that something will happen. Whereas what I would say is whenever you read in Hebrews, when it defines faith in the Bible, it says that faith is the substance of things unseen and the evidence of things hoped for. That definition necessitates that you believe in something for which there is no proof, there is no evidence that you have, and it's literally, it requires that you believe in something that you can't necessarily demonstrate or replicate. And I don't mean this as a gotcha, but I just mean it as let's clarify the terms that we're using here. And you can't use one at the beginning of your argument and then sneak in the other definition later on. So while, yes, a person has faith that the airplane that they're on will get them somewhere safely, it is not the same thing as having faith in your deity or in your sacred scriptures according to the definition in the sacred scriptures. Because whenever someone gets on an airplane, they're not getting on an airplane based off of the substance of things unseen and the evidence of things that are hoped for. Now you could say, well, you're really hoping that you'll make it there safe. It's like, yes. But what you're really doing is you're making a calculated risk estimate, whether you really understand it or not. Because, I think that the majority of people that fly today probably would not be so willing to jump on an airplane from the 1910s, the 1920s, when the statistical survival rate of those airplanes, especially on long distance journeys, whenever they hadn't, invented a lot of the high-tech navigation equipment that they have today, and they weren't nearly as stable. I don't think the same people would get on the airplane. Now, would they necessarily address it to you in some sort of scholarly thesis stating their reason of certainty based off of, the exact probabilistic standards that they're using? No. But they would be able to tell you, well, I don't necessarily think that this airplane's going to be able to get me somewhere safely, and I'm not willing to take that risk. So in other words, when people get on airplanes today, they're doing so for the same reasons. It's still more or less arguably scientifically reasoned upon that, hey, I'm going to get in this airplane, and people know I have a better chance of dying on the way to the airport in a car from a car crash than I have of dying once I get on this aircraft. So the two, all I'm saying is the two types of faith are not the same thing. What's more similar and what could be a better argument is, I think, if someone came in and said, hey, we need to get somewhere safely, we need to get there quickly, let's use my magic carpet. And you would say, what? and say, yes, I have this sacred book, this ancient book of sacred scriptures, and according to this book of ancient sacred scriptures, we can get on this magic carpet and we can fly to our destination safely and arrive. You could up the ante by saying you're in a burning building, or you're in a town experiencing some sort of calamity, and if you don't escape, you'll die. Or you're somewhere where you have to jump from a very tall height, and someone's trying to convince you can either A, get on the magic carpet and jump, and if it doesn't work, you're going to fall to your death, or B, you can wait it out and maybe you'll miraculously survive the fire or whatever, or C, you can use some other mode of transport that's been verified to work safely, like an airplane or a helicopter or something like that. And my point is that it's much more useful to understand what the definition of faith is that we're using, and also to consider that the flying carpet, I think, is a great example, because someone could say it's a lot more akin to what faith is. You have to take someone's word for it. There's no evidence that it worked. There's no photos or pictures or videos of individuals flying on magic carpets, but there could be all sorts of people that tell you they believe that the magic carpet exists if they really needed it to, that they experience, good sentiment and good emotion whenever they sit down and really pray and think about, and just their faith in that magic carpet in a time of need, gives them strength to get by. I think that's a lot more, what's the word for it? That's maybe a lot more realistic of a comparison rather than saying an airplane. I think something else that I've wanted to talk about is the fact that sometimes theists will posit to atheists that, well, you don't know where the world came from, and they'll use the specific question is, why is there something rather than nothing, and nature doesn't necessarily. And the rules of nature don't tell us where it came from. And maybe I'm slightly misquoting whatever version of this you either may have heard, or whatever version, if you're a theist, you might have used on someone. But the basic premise is, we don't know everything, therefore God. Even though we know that there was, or we believe that there was, that the universe is expanding, and therefore it had at one point it materialized out of nothing, although that's actually been debated, to be honest with you. But either way, the premise is, why is there something instead of nothing? And what I use, I think, to kind of conceptualize that question is let's have a make-believe world where someone invented powered flight, but they actually hadn't discovered, they didn't have the means to discover, and they had not yet discovered Bernoulli's principle. So let's pretend like airplanes had been invented. And let's, for fun, let's just pretend like they were as advanced as they are today. But we still didn't understand what actual scientific mechanism, the gradient or the difference in high pressure under the wing and low pressure above the wing. We didn't understand that that's what caused lift. And let's even pretend like this society or this civilization ceased to exist. All of humanity was wiped out before we had the proper tools to discover Bernoulli's principle and understand why lift worked. I propose that if that happened, that the people who had mastered flight and were making these crafts would probably or possibly argue that it was magic or their God that was making this aircraft fly, because they didn't understand the principle. But would that mean that they were right? So this world is just like our own reality. Airplanes work in the exact same manner, just human beings had not discovered Bernoulli's principle enough to understand that that's what caused the airplane to fly. That would not mean that something supernatural is what explained flight. It would just mean that human beings up to that point had not been able to discern and discover what it was that was the law, or that was the principle that caused flight to work demonstratively and continuously. And I think that that's a useful way of thinking about the argument that, well, you don't know everything about evolution. You don't know exactly how the origin of life started. It's like, you're right, we haven't necessarily figured that out, and we may not ever necessarily get there. At least not to everyone's satisfaction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be magic. It just means that we may not have the tools, or it might have happened so far in the past, or whatever, that we may not be able to verifiably and demonstratively show exactly where. But that doesn't mean that something supernatural has to be what made life. Similarly, why is there something instead of nothing? That's a common, the core of the theist argument. And to be honest with you, it was one that was very convincing to me for a while. But I've come to realize that I don't think that theists necessarily have any stronger of a leg to stand on in this argument than atheists do. And that's because while a theist has a convenient reason for not even trying to answer the question, if they're going to really try and stick it to an atheist as to why they believe in something why there's something instead of nothing, then they should probably do the due diligence of answering that question themselves. And that is, why is there a God instead of no God? Why is there a universe that has a God either in it or external to it, but why was there a God in the first place? And of course, the theist would say, well, he's God. We don't have to know. But if you're going to allow yourself that excuse, then you should allow that same excuse to atheists or naturalists or whatever, to people who say, look, we don't know what the conditions were when the universe began. When we have no idea what conditions pre-existed that, if anything. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there was a supernatural entity that summoned it into being. And if you're going to really stand there and demand that the atheist answer that question, then you better well have an answer for why is there a God? Because who put God in place? Does that mean, the intelligent design question, or the intelligent design argument? You just extend that steps backwards like an infinite mirror. Well, if there has to be an intelligent designer, if there has to be, then who intelligently or what intelligently designed God? And again, this is not to say that this is proof that there is no God. It's just to say when we sit down and we have a conversation, let's get some of this other stuff out of the way first, so we can spend some time talking about what we consider to actually be proof in our belief in God or reasons why we don't believe in God. And I think that's kind of something that's useful to consider or useful to think about. I think the last thing, and this is a critique of some atheists that I hear. So I try to be as fair as possible. I hear some people that are atheists hinging on the definition that atheism is a lack of belief in God. And that's fair. That's a lack of belief in God. It's certainly a lack of belief in the specific God of someone's scriptures. I think there are still atheists who believe that a supernatural entity is possible. They just don't happen to believe that it's the God of the Bible or the God of the Quran. But they still consider themselves atheists because, no, I don't believe in your God. But yeah, I believe it's possible that the universe had a supernatural beginning. That's what some might say. I don't think it's necessarily intellectually, I don't want to say honest because I don't know that they're deceiving themselves, but I don't think that it's intellectually discerning enough when an atheist goes up beyond saying, I lack faith in this God or in any gods. When the atheist goes on what I would call the offensive and states to the affirmative that there is no God, I think that person is more than just an atheist. I think that person, I don't know what the term would be, but maybe a non-theist or a non-extant theist or something along the lines, some sort of definition or word that is used to show not only do I lack a faith in God, but I actually believe that there are none. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about that is because just as much as any atheist will tell you that if you're trying to witness to them and you're basing your argument for why there's a God or why Allah is real, and you're using your sacred text as proof, that doesn't matter to atheists. You can't use something we don't believe in to make us believe in something we don't believe in. Similarly, though, I don't think atheists realize, as much as I enjoy listening to him, I don't think Aaron Ra realizes that whenever he uses a natural argument for, well, these are the rules of nature and there's no room in them for God, I don't think that he realizes that what he's arguably doing the same thing, and that is he's bringing something into the argument that doesn't necessarily have the same weight behind it as what he ascribes to it whenever he uses it with the other person. And so for that, I think it's also useful to have some sort of make-believe scenario. So let's pretend like whatever fantastical world from your childhood or from your journey in adult fiction, what have you. So The Lord of the Rings or any Disney magical place, in those worlds, they appear to be almost exactly like our Earth. In other words, they have natural rules that govern them. Streams flow downhill, water precipitates, or water turns into gas, goes up, forms clouds, it rains. They have the same water cycle. They have gravity, all of those other. So in other words, the natural laws exist in that world. However, in those worlds, magic is a real thing, or gods and goddesses are a real thing. They exist outside of the laws of nature. So in other words, at those entities' will, they can reach into the real world, the natural world, and they can suspend the natural order of things and change it up. And so I think it's useful to realize that that's what theists believe. Theists don't necessarily not believe in science. They believe that science governs, 99.99999% of all occurrences in the physical world. They just believe that there is, be it insignificant or very, very small, they believe that there is room for there to be something for which the laws of nature do not apply. It can reach in, and that entity for theists is their God, or gods or goddesses or whatever. For people who believe in magic, that's where magic happens. It's outside of the laws of nature. So I think you have to realize when you're dealing with a theist, to say that they don't believe in science is dismissing them too readily, and it's not being intellectually thorough enough. What they're actually doing is they're saying, no, more than likely, some don't. Some just completely reject science. But the majority of theists believe in science. They just think that there's room, in addition to what science can explain, there's room for stuff that science absolutely cannot. And in that view of reality, it makes sense to say there's stuff that's absolutely not governed by science. But that will keep these two people from talking past each other, because the atheist can't talk to the theist who believes in some form of supernatural and only use science to disprove it. Say, well, science tells us that this doesn't happen. The theist would say, of course science tells you that this can't happen. But what I'm telling you is that there's something that exists outside of science or the natural laws or the natural order of things that has power over the natural order of things and can change it. So what it really boils down to, and this is, I think, most useful for understanding if you're on the verge and you're not sure what to believe, if you do believe, if you don't believe, I think the question comes down to, where is the preponderance of evidence for you personally? And that is, what do you think is real? And I know what I believe as an atheist. I don't believe that there is a God, certainly not the God of the Bible. But I think it's useful to understand that what you're really looking at is not whether or not science is true, because many theists would say science is true, it can just be suspended. And you're also not only looking at is this scripture true? But what you're really looking at is, what makes the most sense to me? And what do I think is the reality? And so for me personally, again, and I don't want to get too much into this because you're going to be on your own journey or your own path, so to speak. But for me personally, it was the realization that there's a lot of things that refute the Bible historically, logically, scientifically, etc. That cannot simultaneously be true with the Bible being true. That being said, I think that you have to realize this very important distinction when you're trying to talk to someone of the other belief. You should, just as much as you shouldn't use the Bible or the Quran to argue your God to an atheist. An atheist, I think, has to understand that science alone is not going to be enough to disprove the existence of a God to a theist. And those are some things that I think if atheists and theists could come into a conversation having already sorted those things out, the fact that there's arguably two definitions of faith, the realization that the argument, why is there something instead of nothing, cuts both ways, and then the realization that it is in my view, it's a positive claim, not just to say you lack a belief, but to say that there is no God, and to realize that using science alone to refute any sort of theology or belief in a God is insufficient for the believer, because the believer doesn't necessarily doubt that science governs the majority of occurrences in the real world. The fact is that the theist believes that there is something that is unconstrained by the laws of science, and that something is the supernatural, that something is their God, that something is angels, that something is spirits or goddesses, what have you. So I think if everyone could understand those things, we'd waste a lot less time at the outset, and we could get into what people on the verge of believing or not believing in a God really want to get at, and that is, why do you believe? What is the proof that you offer that there is a God and that it is your God? And that's when it gets down to personal things like personal testimony, maybe philosophical or ideological debates or whatever. And I'm not necessarily going to say that those are always strong, because I've obviously walked away from that. But that's why those issues are really more at the heart of what matters than, playing these gotcha games with things like, well, you have faith that an airplane will take you somewhere safely, or why is there something instead of nothing, or I can disprove God because I can show you an evolutionary table, etc. I do think that evolution is a strong rebuttal to the creation story, but I understand where a neo or a more modern theist could say, yeah, maybe evolution is certainly demonstrated to be true, but maybe that's just the method that God chose to use to populate this planet. He still is the one who set it all in motion. So there's room for both. I know which side of the argument I'm on, but let's spend more time talking about the why instead of these little word games and gotchas. So thank you.